Hello everybody, and welcome to the University of Montana this evening for this interesting and exciting event. It is a rare opportunity that we learned about when we had a call to find out that the European Union ambassador was going to be in Missoula, and would we want an opportunity to have a conversation with him, with and for our community and our students. And I was very excited, and it reminded me about our university's opportunity to make this kind of event happen. So I will introduce our guest and our host for the conversation. So let's bring them out, and then I'll introduce them just a little bit more. Michael Punke and David O'Sullivan. This is an opportunity for these two gentlemen, I think, who've known each other for a while in the world of world trade. Am I right? Is that how you first got to know each other? Ambassador O'Sullivan was just telling me that he introduced himself once at a party in, I think, China. And it was stunningly beautiful people, of course. And one of them introduced herself to him as the equivalent of the editor of Chinese Vogue. And he said, oh, and then she asked what he did. And it was some, what was it you said?
Director of Trade for the European Commission.
And she said, oh, fascinating. And he said then, this is just a few moments ago, that he thought he needed to have a better chat-up line for such events in the future. Let me first introduce Michael Punke. He will be facilitating our conversation tonight. Thank you, Michael, for making this happen. He has a Renaissance man background. That's again a phrase I'm stealing from my conversation earlier today from the ambassador. Really such an interesting set of careers he's had. And then you look at him, it's like some of my doctors these days, they look like they're 28. And then you check their resumes, and they've been and done so many things, and so I'll mention just a few of those. He is now Vice President for Global Public Policy of Amazon Web Services. So he says he gets to do it in jeans, but he commutes to Seattle and works in Seattle a few days each week. He has more than 25 years, go figure, experience in international trade and regulatory issues. He served from 2010 to 2017 as Deputy U.S. Trade Representative and U.S. Ambassador to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. And then, complete topic subject. He's also the author of The Revenant, basis for the award-winning film. Didn't Leonardo DiCaprio win an Oscar for that film, as I recall? And you were probably nominated for the... No?
Nothing.
No? I think I'm sure that was a big oversight. But that particular book has been translated into more than 20 languages, and it was an international bestseller. So, what an interesting background. I will tell you that even before reading your book about the fire in Butte, my twin brother who's from the California area, his best friend and granddaughter and your daughter are good friends, and so my twin brother has stayed in his house in Geneva. That's our small world for a couple weeks. You probably didn't even know it, but they were very nice to your home while they were there. I'm told. And now our special guest, the ambassador, David O'Sullivan. What a fabulous name. Now, if I have a name like Sheila, that I've got Irish. And I do. My Irish ancestors came to Wisconsin in the 1850s. But everybody has Irish ancestors, so that's not all that special. I get that. He serves as ambassador and head of the European Union delegation to the United States, and he has served in that role in Washington, D.C. since 2014. His distinguished career includes leadership in establishing the EU Diplomatic Service, one of the largest diplomatic networks with 140 delegations around the world. And he has served in a number of senior official posts in the European public service. I asked him today for a couple of interesting background issues about him. One, I just couldn't help but ask because I needed to spend a little bit of time in Washington, D.C., and I see friends in the audience who live there and work there. And he said, well, we live not too far from Washington Circle. In fact, he said, last winter we got some new neighbors. The immediate past president of the United States of America lives about 3 doors down, is that about right? And the Secret Service did not anticipate the complexity of having a neighbor who entertains, you know, occasionally, maybe fairly often, a couple hundred people an evening, and that created some issues. But he said, you said they've kind of worked it out. And,
They're excellent.
oh, they're very good. First, but how interesting is that? And then I said, well, have you had the neighbors over for tea? And he said, yes. So, but I guess we don't get to ask him all about that tonight. So,
No, I'll ask him.
oh, good, good, good. And then the other thing I asked him, I said, what's something kind of interesting from your background, Ambassador? And he said, I know, you can tell folks that in 1973 and 1974, in my youth, he said, I spent 2 different summers interning or working really, at the YMCA in Minnesota.
No.
You know, staying there, working.
Chicago.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's the Minnesotan in me. I was just sure it was Minneapolis. Chicago.
Next time.
In Chicago. Actually, you know, that is, I know, I have a friend who worked at the YMCA in Minneapolis, so that's where that wiring came from. And so he worked there and got to know a little bit, a lot, obviously, about the United States during that experience as a, you know, working with people from a variety of backgrounds in Chicago. And I asked him, well, that was an interesting time in our history. He said, yes, he watched on a little YMCA, little lobby black and white TV as an earlier president of the United States stepped forth to resign. Think of that, you know, when you're visiting the country briefly. So these 2 individuals with their great backgrounds are going to have a conversation. Michael will lead it, and we get to enjoy it. Thank you very much for being here.
So thanks, Sheila, very much for the introduction. I appreciate that. And I want to say a couple quick thanks before we dive in here. Thanks, as I said, to Sheila and also to the University of Montana for sponsoring this event tonight. It's great to live in a university town and to be able to take advantage of events like this. My second thank you, and most obvious one, is to Ambassador O'Sullivan and his wife, Agnes, who is also here down in the front row. I really appreciate that you've taken the time to travel away from Washington, D.C. A lot of ambassadors to the United States don't do that, and as we know, living out in the heartland, we're a very big and a very diverse country, and you can't really learn about this place unless you are willing to travel, and David has done an awful lot of that, and we're very happy to have him here in Missoula. Lastly, I want to say thanks to the people who are here tonight. Really appreciate that you have turned out. One of the things I said to David and Agnes is how much, one of the things I love about Missoula is it's a place that likes to listen and think and learn, and appreciate all of you taking the effort to come out here tonight, and hopefully we'll have a good, stimulating conversation that won't let you down. One brief thing that is not in David's bio that I want to mention about him, because I met David in 2010, and when he was in his earlier job as the top trade negotiator for the European Union, and we sat across the table from each other, sometimes in what were fairly contentious discussions, to put it politely. David looks like he's not somebody who yells, but he actually is quite capable of yelling. I learned 2 things about David that I really admire. One thing I admire is that he's an incredibly strong advocate for his people. But the second thing about David that I admire, and these two things don't always go together, is he's also very much a problem solver and a bridge builder. And he's one of those rare people who can combine those two things and never give up being an advocate for the nations that he represents, but always able to use whatever flexibility he has to find creative solutions. And I think that's something that we can use in the world today, and I've always appreciated that, that combination of attributes about you. I'm going to start off our conversation tonight with easy questions, and we'll warm up to harder ones. And at the end, I want to leave ample time for people in the audience to ask questions as well. But Sheila talked about some of the background of your background and some of the different jobs you've had over the course of quite a few decade career. I'm always interested in in superlatives. Highest moments, lowest moments. What were some of the highest and lowest moments that pop to mind when you think about the things that you've worked on over the years?
Well, Michael, firstly, I'd like to echo your thanks to the university and President Sheila Stearns for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. I'd like to thank you for agreeing to do it. And I don't think I ever yelled at you, Michael. Really. But you know, he always likes to play one-upmanship. That's his negotiating strategy. But Michael was also a great advocate for the United States, but also a very fair dealer. So we had the respect is mutual. And I'd also like to thank all of you for turning up tonight. I hope the conversation justifies it. Thank you very much. And to your point about traveling outside Washington, yes, I mean, you know, I've come to the conclusion that Washington is held in as much esteem in the rest of the United States as Brussels is in the rest of Europe. And Washington is a fascinating place, but the real America is outside. And I have enormous respect for this country, for the American people, and also for the diversity of this country. And that's something you can only appreciate when you actually get out and travel around. And it's not my first time to Missoula. I hope it won't be my last, but it's a great opportunity in this capacity to come back to Montana and to come back to Missoula, so thank you very much for that. To your question, Michael, I think probably the high point of my career that comes to mind is when I was asked to be Chief of Staff to a new President of the European Commission, President Romano Prodi, who was just retired as Prime Minister of Italy. The previous European Commission had just been forced to resign in controversial circumstances, allegations of corruption and inappropriate behavior. There was a sense in which the European Union was really in another one of our crises. We'll probably talk about a few more of those later on. We do crises quite well. And we had to put together a new commission very quickly to try and restore the credibility of the institution. And so I traveled around over a summer. I was appointed to President Prodi in May. We needed to put together the commission and then get a vote, a confirmation vote in the European Parliament in September. I traveled with him to all the capitals, met all the prime ministers of Europe. We discussed who they were going to nominate, what jobs they would get, how we would put the commission together, what are the changes we would announce to restore some confidence in the institution. And that was just the most intense and exhilarating period of my life. We put the commission together, we got the confidence vote, and I think we did restore some of the credibility in the European Commission as an institution, and that was a really exhilarating moment. The low point for me was undoubtedly in 2008 when we thought we had succeeded in negotiating a new multilateral trade deal in the Doha Development Agenda. We were in Geneva. We'd spent 3 intensive weeks in Geneva. On the Friday night, we were sure we'd got the deal. We were congratulating. We thought this was a really important breakthrough for the international community. The deal fell apart over the weekend, and by Monday, it was in ruins. And I've never seen strong men cry, but actually when Pascal Lamy, who was then the Director General of the WTO, announced that the deal was over and we had to give up, he was on the verge of tears, and so were several other people in the room. I was not, some kind of emotional deficiency on my part, but that for me was really that sense of almost having succeeded in a major breakthrough, and then to see it just fade away in front of your eyes was really for me a low point.
So we won't delve into your emotional deficiencies.
Thank you.
Different type of conversation, but I do want to get a little bit more of a flavor for your day-to-day life as the EU ambassador to the United States. Sheila talked about your neighbors. She mentioned former President Obama. I believe you also have Ivanka and Jared in the neighborhood.
Just around the corner.
So is your day...
We're very bipartisan.
Is your day just having a lot of teas and cocktail parties with your neighbors, or is it more diverse than that? Give us if there is a typical day, give us a sense of what a typical day is for the EU ambassador to the United States.
Well, you've been an ambassador, though in a multilateral context, which is slightly different in Geneva. Frankly, no 2 days are the same. I mean, it's one of the joys of the job. But if I kind of divide it up into what are the typical elements of a day, one which for me is very important, but which is very different to a normal ambassador is I have 28 member states whom I represent. They all have embassies in DC. Washington is the capital of bilateralism. Every member state of the European Union wants to be in Washington, wants to promote the bilateral relations between their country and the United States. And they are, if you like, my constituency. And I have to keep them on board. I have to work with them. So a certain amount of my time is spent touching base and coordinating with the member states. I chair a breakfast once a month of the ambassadors. My deputy chairs a meeting once a week of the deputies of the embassies, and our sort of sectoral councillors, trade councillors, political councillors, scientific councillors, economic councillors meet once a week. So we have a very intense process of coordination between the 28 member states of the European Union in Washington, just to make sure we're all on the same page, we're all sharing the same information, and we're all passing the same messages. The next sort of element of my work is, of course, working with the administration and with Congress on whatever are the issues of the day. This week it's Iran, it's the Iran deal, it's the possibility that something could go wrong in that when the president is being asked to certify the Iran deal, Iran's compliance with the deal on the 15th of October. In fact, I'm having to cut short my trip. I'm in Montana. I'd hoped to go on to Wyoming, your home state, and South Dakota. I've had to cut that short, so I will fly back early on Tuesday because we've got a lot of contacts, particularly in Congress, to try and make sure that we preserve what we think is a very important achievement of international diplomacy, preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. But it can be something else. It can be trade. It can be data privacy, which is a big issue between the EU and the United States, or it can be other foreign policy issues. And then the other part is trying to write reports back to Brussels to explain what's happening in the United States. And that's the easy part, as you can imagine, particularly these days. But that is doubly complicated because there is so much coverage of the United States in real time in the European media that the question is, well, what's the value added of an ambassador? In the old days, I mean, going back to the 19th century, the ambassador in Beijing would write a lengthy missive back to his capital, London, Paris, Berlin, whatever. It would take 3 weeks or 4 weeks to get there. They would read it. It was probably all the news they had coming from Beijing. They would then write back some questions, which would take another 4 or 5 weeks to get to the ambassador, and the ambassador would then have written another report. Nowadays, it's happening in real time. I wake up in the morning at 5 o'clock. I've already got 20 emails from people saying, oh, we've just seen that President Trump has said this. What does that mean? What, you know, and you're just saying, I've just gotten out of bed, because, of course, they're 6 hours ahead, by the way, which is a real disadvantage. So trying to add value by giving insights which are not necessarily available in the press commentary is one of the ways in which you try to justify your salary.
Which is always a good thing. I want to focus on something that you said a little bit earlier about the EU being good at crises and the difficult challenge of coordinating a position among 28 member states. I told you the questions would start to get tougher here.
Yeah.
Is it the case that Europe can only make decisions when there's crises, because it's only at that moment of crises that people have sort of walked the plank and are forced to decide? And I guess related to that question is a broader one of of can the EU be strategic and nimble in a world where things move very fast?
I think we too often end up making policy in response to crises for the reason you give, that when we look at an issue and we intellectually know how it should be solved, but it's politically difficult for one country or the other, you tend to postpone it. I've never met a politician yet who will not postpone any decision until tomorrow unless it's absolutely necessary to take the decision today. And so I think we do suffer from a tendency to let problems fester until it turns into a crisis, and then we solve it. It's not that people want to do it that way. It's just that the dynamics of trying to find solutions to very complex problems between 28 countries sometimes mean that it's difficult to get the pieces together. I think we've got better at it, but I think there will always be that risk. To your point of, how nimble the European Union can be, I think actually in a situation of crisis we can be remarkably nimble. But it does require the sort of focusing of minds that come with a sense of urgency in order to do that. The normal pace of decision making is much slower because we need to build consensus, we need to bring 500 million people with us, we need to bring 28 governments with us, we need to bring 750 directly elected members of the European Parliament with us. And frankly, the European Union is a peace project. And we've had 70 years of no great power conflict on the European continent since the European Union was created. And you have to go back to the 16th century to find an equivalent period of peace and stability in Europe. So that's quite an achievement. And if the price of that is that our policy making is not quite as nimble as would be that of a member state or a nation state, I think it's a price worth paying.
So let me ask you a... Let me ask you.
Thank you.
I'm not going to stop anybody from applying for you tonight.
Who's that person?
Let me ask you a sort of philosophical question related to that about the role of government. In the U.S., we have a very long tradition of tension between federal and state governments, and states guard very jealously constitutional prerogatives, and throughout our history, that's been a topic of intense debate and even war. I think for Americans, it's often very surprising to see the degree to which European countries have given up parts of their sovereignty to the European Union. You talked about war, and I'm guessing that might be part of your answer here. But how is it that the U.S. and Europe have come to such a different place in terms of how they view the issue of national sovereignty?
Because we have completely different starting points. You started from 13 colonies who won their independence by working together against a great colonial power. No one of those colonies on their own could have won independence. So you started from the knowledge that you actually had to work together in order to achieve the independence that you felt was necessary for your country. And then you had to figure out how to turn that into a functioning government for an independent United States. And as you know, you went through some very difficult debates at the founding of this country. And the Constitution was only a sort of second iteration of the Federation. And if you read the Federalist or Anti-Federalist papers of the time, you see some of the debates that we're now having in Europe. But your fundamental starting point was you wanted to be free of a colonial power, and therefore you banded together. And you understood that, but at the same time you wanted to retain powers to the states. And remember, this was in the 18th century, a very different world to what we have today. The European starting point is completely different. We have seen what excessive emphasis on national sovereignty delivers to you. It delivers war. We've had constant war in Europe from the 19th century through the First World War, through the Second World War. We delivered two global wars and the Holocaust because of our national rivalries. So when that ended in 1945, people said, we need to find a different way of doing business. We cannot allow ourselves to continue with this national rivalry and this national hatred. And that inevitably involved not giving up our nationality, not giving up our national identity, but pooling it and recognizing that you could be German and European, you could be Spanish and European, and that you could be proud of your country, be proud of your language, your culture. I agree entirely that all politics is local, and what really counts for people is what happens in their locality, their schools, their healthcare system, their education system. Do they have a job? These are the things that really matter, and much of this is delivered at local or national level. But at the same time, in the 21st century, a continent the size of Europe, or the countries of Europe, cannot survive and thrive other than by coming together and forming some kind of federation. Not a United States of Europe, but some kind of integrated process that prevents us from ever going back to the excesses of nationalism that we knew in the 20th century, and delivers some of the economies of scale of a larger market, more competitiveness, and a greater trading bloc than would otherwise be the case.
So let me pivot off of that to talk about Brexit, which I'm sure will not surprise you as a topic. Many people look at Brexit, particularly a year ago, and were saying this is the beginning of the disintegration of the European Union. And a major member state like the United Kingdom leaving was going to be the harbinger of many more leaving, and at a minimum ending up with a very different type of European Union. What do you think about that today? Is the EU headed towards breaking up, or a fundamentally different type of union than the one you had 5 years ago?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the Danish physicist Niels Bohr said, prediction is a very hazardous exercise, particularly when it comes to the future. So I want to be very careful in making firm predictions about where Europe will be 10 or 15 years from now. If you'd asked me in 1979, when I first started working in the European Commission, when we were 9 member states, we didn't have a single market, we didn't have a single currency, would we, 30 years from then, would we have 28 member states? Would we have a currency shared by 19, which is the world's second reserve currency? Would we have the largest single market in the world? Would we have Europe as the largest donor of development assistance, the largest donor of humanitarian assistance in the world? I would have said, no, that's unimaginable. And yet we're here. So I certainly don't want to say for certain that things could not go wrong. I think the Brexit decision, it's important to acknowledge that we ultimately are a democratic structure in Europe. The European Union is predicated utterly on democracy. That is why we have a provision in our treaty that allows country to leave. You don't have a comparable provision in your constitution, and you fought a civil war over it at one point. I'm not saying you should, I'm just saying that we actually accept that at the end of the day, people are in this with their consent. They are not forced to be in the European Union. No one forced the UK to join the European Union. They applied, they wanted to get in, they came in, they had a referendum to confirm that they wanted to be there in 1975, which was massively endorsed. But now they've changed their mind. We understand, we respect it, we regret it. But I don't believe that that's going to be replicated elsewhere. In fact, in the days after the vote in the UK, support for the European Union in all 27 other member states went up, surged up actually, into higher levels of public support than we'd ever seen. I think people look at what is happening in the UK relative to leaving the European Union, and they're actually saying, actually, that doesn't seem like such a good idea. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. Maybe the UK will thrive outside the European Union. I wish them well. We wish to have good relations with them as an ally, as a partner, but it is going to be a different relationship than that which we had with them when they were members. But for the rest of us, I think the debate is really about how we go forward. You've seen this week President Macron came forward with some ambitious ideas about further European integration. President Juncker, the President of the European Commission 2 weeks ago, also laid out ideas as to how we could complete economic and monetary union, how we could do more on security and defense, how we can do more in working together to combat terrorism, to deal with the issue of migration. These are common challenges which we are utterly convinced we can only face by working together. Individual countries will not be able to solve or address these problems, and we need to figure out how we do that while nonetheless preserving the identity and the autonomy and the maximum sovereignty of our constituent member states, because no one wants to give up their nationality.
And has Brexit had the effect of causing a pause in Brussels to ponder this question of have we gone too far? Are we regulating too deeply into the affairs of member states? Has there been that type of introspection? And if so, what are the conclusions of that introspection?
Michael, it's a constant debate in Brussels because everyone is conscious that we should only be doing at European level what we can do better than what can be done by states individually. Now, where you draw that line is necessarily a matter of political debate, as it is in this country. But that's the fundamental principle. And the current Commission, which took office in 2014, has made a point of systematically looking at regulations and laws to see if there are things which can be repealed, which can be rolled back in situations where perhaps they are no longer serving the purpose they originally did. But what I want to make absolutely clear, and this is so important that Americans understand this, that nothing is decided by the European Union except through the democratic consent of our member states, the governments of our member states, and the directly elected members of the European Parliament. Decisions are not taken by unelected technocrats like myself. Yes, we service the political process, we advise, we implement what is decided, but the process of legislation in Brussels is decided by the member states themselves. So when member states say Brussels is interfering too much, that's themselves. If member states want us to do less, they have simply not just decide on legislation. They have that. The fact is that 99% of the proposals which the Commission makes for legislation is done at the instigation of member states or the European Parliament saying there is a problem which is not being adequately addressed at national level and it needs a European legislation to fix it. And that's why we go forward. And so I take your point, but frankly, it is the member states themselves and it is the members of the European Parliament who decide where the cursor is put between what remains the responsibility of member states and what should become, in the best interests of all of us, a matter of European legislation and action.
I want to push you then a little bit further that direction.
Doesn't surprise me.
You mentioned that the EU is not the United States of Europe. Why not? Would it be better and more effective if Europe were more modeled on the U.S. model? And hasn't that been something that was in the back of some of the founders' minds? Why not go the additional measure?
Your model works so well. No. I go back to the point I made about a different starting point. You started from a disparate group of colonies who had to band together to create a new reality on this continent. We start from the fact that we actually had, one of the little known sort of trivia I like to ask, a few trivial pursuits questions about the United States. Which are the states which only have one member of Congress? The other one is, which of the 50 states was an independent country? There's only 4. California, Hawaii, Texas, and, wait for it, Vermont. Yes, it was an independent republic before it joined the Federation. So that's my point. You had no prior existence as independent nations. We suffer from the opposite. We've had an abundance of national identity and national existence, and we're trying to move from that towards something more functional in the 21st century. Therefore, I don't think that you have to say that the end point has to be a United States of Europe. The objective is to keep the maximum of power and authority and control at the national level where it can best serve the interests of our citizens. And by the way, not even at the national level, at the subnational level. Germany, thanks to the constitution designed by the United States after the Second World War, is even more federal than you are as a structure. It's for the Germans, education policy, for example, is entirely decided by their lender, by their states, not by the federal government. So there are different models across Europe about how you run a country. But the purpose of the exercise is not to dismantle the nation state or to diminish the nation state. It is, firstly, to make sure that nationalism doesn't turn into aggressive behavior, but also that by working together we can deliver better outcomes in certain areas. And we only need to do it in those areas where it delivers a better outcome. We don't have to federalize everything.
Let me flip the Brexit question around. Has the UK made a horrible mistake? Will they come to regret the decision to withdraw from the European Union? How will that play out?
I mean, if you ask me, but you've read my CV, he would say that, wouldn't he? Yes, of course I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake because I think the UK has missed the point in the sense that I think many of the things they say they want to do when they leave the European Union, like being a global trading nation, they could actually do it better if they were in the European Union. I think the question of the UK's influence in the world, I think they could probably do that more effectively by being a part of the European Union than being outside it. But it's not for me to, what I say doesn't matter. I'm not British, I don't have a vote. They have had a democratic referendum. The issue has been decided and arbitrated by the British people. They are leaving, and I respect that. As an economist, I find it difficult to see how this ends well for the British economy, just objectively, because they are giving up access to the largest and wealthiest single market in the world, which is in their immediate neighborhood, in return for less privileged access to that market, however we define that. And I don't think you can compensate for that by cutting trade deals with the United States or China or Japan. And by the way, the EU anyway is one of the leaders of cutting trade deals, and we actually already have very substantial free trade agreement with large parts of the world, and we have a very substantial agenda. So I don't quite get it, but I respect it. I don't know at the end of the day whether the British people will wish to revisit this decision at some point. I doubt it anytime soon. And we have to try and figure out, which is not going to be simple, how we build nonetheless a constructive relationship with the United Kingdom, which remains a NATO ally, which remains a friend, which remains an integral part of Europe in the broadest sense, and on which we will continue to rely for security and cooperation in counterterrorism and other issues. So we're going to have to build a new relationship. It's going to be challenging, but we're committed to trying to make the best of what is ultimately a second best solution. For me, there is no happy ending to this matter either for the UK or for us. It's a question of damage limitation and trying to minimize the damage which results to both parties from this decision.
Let me ask you a question about the mechanics of negotiating the divorce, if you want to look at it that way. One thing that's striking to me that I think a lot of people haven't focused on yet is this very real deadline of March 2019.
2019, yeah.
March 29th, 2019, by which time, if there's not agreement, the UK is out, even if there's no new legal regime to govern the relationship. There's a whole bunch of things to negotiate between now and then, and the negotiations don't exactly seem to be off to a running start. Are you worried about getting to that deadline and having a new arrangement in place? How people talk about a hard Brexit and going off a cliff. Is that what the negotiation is headed for?
I hope not, and I think both parties will want to do everything they can to avoid that. I think the difficulty of the situation stems at least in part from the fact that while there was a clear outcome to the referendum, which is that the British people wanted to leave the European Union, there was actually no clear plan of what leaving the European Union means. And Paul Simon says there are 50 ways to leave your lover. There are probably 50 ways to leave the European Union. You can leave the institutions but remain in the single market. You can leave the single market but remain in the customs union. We have a relationship with Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, who are in what we call the European Economic Area, which is a sort of outer circle of European integration but not part of the political institutions of the European Union. I mean, you know, there's a kind of spectrum of possibilities, and we are not yet clear on the European side where on that spectrum the UK wishes to position itself. And that makes the discussion very complicated. And as you can see, they're having a lively discussion in real time in the UK about where on that spectrum they want to find themselves. I mean, seen from our perspective, it might have been good if they decided that before they told us they wanted to leave and before we started the clock running on the 2 years, but we are where we are. I would remain confident in the spirit of what we said earlier, that crisis focuses the mind, that in the end some arrangement will be found which avoids a falling off of the cliff, and Mrs. May's recent speech in Florence, which was a constructive contribution to the debate and improved the tone, seemed to open the door to some kind of transition so that we kind of slightly fudge the cutoff point of March 2019, and we agree some sort of continuation of the status quo for a few more years, which then would give us time to build to design the new relationship. One of the things which I think is surprising everyone in the UK, but also on our side, to be frank, is just how complex this question is. What aspects of life are affected? We've discovered there are 789 international agreements to which the EU is a party on behalf of our member states. The UK is going to have to recreate those 789 agreements with other countries and other parties. Trade in nuclear materials, peaceful nuclear materials for nuclear power stations, is governed by the European treaties. When the UK leaves, in theory, they don't have access to nuclear fuel for their power stations. Travel certification of airplanes is now done at the European level, not at national level. The UK has no agency to certify their planes flying in and out of the UK. If we don't have a deal, they will have to ground all their planes the day after they leave. Pharmaceutical products, we have a European equivalent of the FDA, the European Medicines Agency. They're the ones who grant the authorizations for medicines. What happens when the UK leaves? They have no agency of their own, and they're not connected to a European regulatory agency that can do this. And I could multiply these examples to the power of 10, and suddenly people are saying, my goodness, how do we unravel this and then put it all back together? So we are going to need a lot more time to work this through, and I think some kind of transition is probably, which sort of holds things together for a couple of years, is probably the only way forward. But this is not yet agreed, and there's still a lot of negotiating to be done.
Let me ask about one of the other complexities of Brexit, and one you know a lot about as an Irishman. Obviously, lots of really good things have happened in Ireland over the last 20 years in terms of a peace process between Northern Ireland and Ireland. One of the issues that people look at in worrying about Brexit is what will happen to that relationship between Northern Ireland and Ireland in a post-Brexit scenario. Right now, because of the European Union, the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland is there, but not very meaningful, certainly in terms of international trade. What happens after Brexit to that border? And do you worry as an Irishman about backtracking in terms of what's been a remarkable peace process in Ireland over the last couple of decades?
No, I do. I think the peace process in Northern Ireland has been a remarkable achievement. It belongs in the first instance to the people of Northern Ireland and to people who took courageous decisions on both sides of the political divide to put their weapons down and to start talking and to try and build a political process and end the violence. But it was contributed to enormously by the United States, I must say. President Clinton took a huge interest, Senator Mitchell, successive US governments have been hugely supportive. The British and Irish governments also showed great courage in taking on difficult constituencies in both countries to support that peace process. But ultimately, surprisingly, and it's not often commented on, it was joint membership of the European Union that really made the peace process possible, because it squared the circle. What was the squaring of the circle in the peace process in Northern Ireland? It was giving a guarantee to the Unionist community in Northern Ireland that Northern Ireland would remain an integral part of the United Kingdom until such time as a majority in Northern Ireland decided differently. Now that was a remarkable change in the position of Ireland and of Irish nationalism to accept that. But why was that possible? Because the nationalists in Northern Ireland got the guarantee that since Ireland and the UK were both an integral part of the European Union, in practice, in day-to-day life, the island of Ireland is now a single place. You don't notice a frontier. You can live in Northern Ireland and work in the Republic. You can live in the Republic and work in Northern Ireland. You can travel freely and without hindrance throughout the entire country. So the nationalists get the reality of living on a united Ireland. The Unionists have a guarantee that, in fact, their political situation is secured as an integral part of the UK until such time as a majority decide differently. That was a remarkable squaring of a very difficult circle. Now that the UK is leaving, suddenly that is in question. I don't believe there will be a reversion to violence. I think that is really, people have put that behind, but I think it creates incredible new complexities, and frankly we don't know the answer. Both sides, both governments, the Irish government, the British government, are saying they don't want a return of a hard border, but if the UK decides to leave the customs union, decides to leave the single market, you have to have some control of goods and products crossing that frontier. The border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland becomes the external frontier of the EU and the external frontier with the EU of the UK. How is that border non-existent? I honestly don't know. So it is a challenge, and we're very grateful as Ireland that the other 26 members of the European Union have put this issue as one of the top 3 issues that need to be resolved in the first phase of the negotiations before we can move on to discuss the future relations between the UK and the EU at 27, because this really is a very important issue for the future of peace and prosperity on the island of Ireland.
So I want to shift gears more to a discussion of U.S.-European relations, broadly speaking, and we can hone down on it from there. But on the surface, it seems like there's a lot of reasons why the U.S. and Europe ought to get along pretty easily. We're both democracies, we're both market economies. America has imported a huge amount of political and legal tradition from Europe. Europe, despite the French, has imported a whole bunch of American culture into Europe.
The Simpsons.
Well, there you go. And yet, a lot of times it feels like the U.S. and Europe are kind of an old married couple, in a bad sense of the word, kind of crabby with each other all the time. Why is that? Is there something between us that just kind of sticks in each other's craw on an ongoing basis, or how do you see that as the EU ambassador?
I think that this is probably the most important bilateral relationship in the world, and that is true economically. The transatlantic economic corridor is the single most economic corridor in the world, bar none. There is no trading relationship for the Europeans that is important as that with the United States, and vice versa. 80% of foreign direct investment in the United States comes from the European Union, and there is a similar high level of investment by American companies in Europe. We create 15 million jobs across the Atlantic through our trade and investment. So we actually have a very good relationship. But of course, inevitably, sometimes we focus on the problems, on the difficulties, and there are problems and difficulties, and sometimes we trade blows about that. But I think that remains a fundamental bind between us. You mentioned the values agenda and the security agenda. I mean, for Europe, the NATO alliance and the guarantees that come with that from the United States are absolutely vital for the security of the 22 of our member states who are also members of NATO. Ireland, unfortunately, is not a member of NATO. Ireland is neutral. An Irish Prime Minister famously said, "We're neutral, we just haven't decided who we're neutral against." But, you know, for the vast majority of the member states of the European Union, NATO and the American alliance is absolutely vital. And let us be frank, notwithstanding our occasional marital difficulties, we are each other's best friends of first resort, as Vice President Biden once famously said. We know if we're in real difficulty, we will turn to the United States, and I know that the United States, when the chips are down, will turn to the European allies to help out. And that's how it should be, and that's how it will continue to be, because in this changing world, there are alternative models of society being offered by China, by Russia, by Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, by other regimes around the world, which are not models that we would wish, you would wish for this country or we would wish for Europe. And we have to stick together in promoting the values that we share. Does that mean we will always agree? Does that mean we will fight from time to time? I think it's normal and healthy that we disagree. Sometimes I think the American definition of cooperation with Europe is you say to us, here's my plan, wouldn't you like to agree to it? And you sometimes think that we, the Europeans, are kind of squishy and always sort of trying to wiggle out of confrontations and not being as supportive of you in your moments as you would wish. But I think fundamentally we remain each other's best friends, and I think it's going to stay that way for some time.
So part of your job is being, a big part of your job is being the lead diplomat for the European Union to the United States, and you've just lived through a very interesting transition. And whatever people think about Obama or Trump, they're quite different people, quite different philosophies. I've noticed that Trump has said controversial things from time to time.
Really?
How do you manage one relationship with the United States during a period in which the pilot of the plane has changed so dramatically? That must be an ongoing, interesting experience.
Well, it's not the first transition we've had. I mean, you do this every couple of years, strangely enough.
That's true, but it hasn't been quite this stark in a while, in terms of, as I said, whatever you think about Obama versus Trump, they're pretty different guys.
Well, they're different personalities, and it is true that President Trump, to a certain extent, kind of breaks the mold of presidential candidates and a president, and he's doing that consciously. It's disruptive politics, and he's practicing it. And we have to come to grips with that. This is whom the American people have decided to elect as your president, and that is, we have to respect that. And I don't say that with any degree of sarcasm. I say it with great sincerity. This is your choice. We have to work with the new administration, and we will do our best to work with the new administration. Sometimes it's possible, and there is, for the moment, I would say there is relatively more continuity in actual US policy than there is disruption. Now, that may change as the administration gears up and staffs all the different posts which are still not yet filled. It may be that there will be more policy divergence going forward than we have seen until now. But I would say, with the notable exception of the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement on climate change, we have not yet had a major policy difference between the EU and this administration. And in areas such as Afghanistan, for example, where the President has recently set out a new strategy, we are largely in agreement with that. So I think We have to be careful in Europe how people sometimes react to the image of President Trump and to the sort of superficial view versus what is the fundamental direction of European policy, and to what extent, or beg your pardon, of United States policy, and to what extent is that going to pose a problem from a European perspective. And as I say, with the notable exception of climate change, until now, I see some warning signs, but I don't see any dramatic divergences. And say, for example, on the issue of NATO, which was an area where people were concerned, the President seems to have come back to a position which is more in line with American orthodoxy and the continuity of American policy down the years.
So talk about, in that context, how you, as the European ambassador, think about being a diplomat toward the United States. I praised you earlier for not staying inside of the Beltway. How do you balance your time, and how do you, in going between Washington and major states like Montana and major cities like Missoula and other places in the country? And what do you see as the interplay between, in our very big country, between the government in Washington, state governments, cities, companies, all of the sort of stew that is the U.S. political mass? How do you manage that?
With difficulty, I would say, simply because of the scale of the challenge you've just mapped out. For me, witnessing the transition in Washington from one administration to another, and as you say, this is probably an even starker transition than perhaps we have experienced in recent times. It's been a huge crash course in the American Constitution, in the American political system, in terms of the way in which your government works, the White House, the way in which the White House is organized or not organized, the way in which you staff major policy functions across different departments of the government, the relationship with Congress, the judiciary. I mean, you know, this is really your constitution at work, and it's been absolutely fascinating. And we are trying to, as diplomats, operate on all these levels. We're trying to work with the administration, with the White House, with the government departments, with the cabinet secretaries, and then where they exist, the sub-cabinet appointments that have been made, and with Congress, and recognizing that it's a very complex process to try and figure out where policy is going. But to your point on the issue of climate change, for example, while we're very disappointed that the United States government has announced their intention to withdraw from Paris, which we think was a huge step forward in the global fight against climate change, we are very encouraged by the fact that what is actually happening on the ground in states and in cities is going in the opposite direction. I mean, my sense is that most of I think there's 30 states who've signed up to a commitment to try and work still in the direction of the strategy set out in the Paris Agreement. When I go around and talk to cities and mayors, it's absolutely fascinating how committed they are to greener and more sustainable policies addressing issues of climate change, of water conservation, the quality of air, and so forth. And this, for me, is also a fascinating insight. And you mentioned companies. I also get the impression that in the minds of many businesses, the transition to a green economy is now an irreversible business decision. They've decided this is what the customers want, this is actually what makes better business sense. There's also an economic advantage in being at the cutting edge of green technology rather than relying on the old carbon technologies. So I think there is a revolution happening, and certainly we are very actively encouraging contacts between our member states, between European cities, European mayors, and states and cities in the United States who are committed to this agenda. So I take some comfort from the fact that even though the United States, formally speaking, may withdraw from the Paris Agreement, the United States, Inc., in its people and its companies and its states and its cities, is actually going to go very much in the same direction which we're moving in Europe.
So we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and there's two microphones, and if anyone has interest in asking a question, if you wouldn't mind coming down to the microphone so that everyone can hear. And while you're pondering your questions and making your way to the microphones, I'll ask you another question. And I don't want to devolve into crude national stereotypes. But which
Unfortunately, they're usually true. Yeah.
But which of the member states just really bugged the crap out of you?
Yeah, it has to be the British, doesn't it? No, you know, sincerely, one of the things I love in this job is just the enormous respect and affection I have for every single member state of the European Union. I have so come to appreciate the history, the culture, the sophistication of each and every member state, whether that's Luxembourg or Malta, which are the smallest, to Germany, or to Poland, or to Spain. It is fascinating and a privilege as a European public servant to be able to work with that. And you learn something every day about these countries and about their perspective. And you know, you talked about problem solving, and that's one of the things we do in my job. Is you've got 28 member states, you're trying to get something done, there are 28 problems and you have to fix them one by one by one. But every time you discuss the problem with a country, you find they're not just being difficult, they actually have a problem. It may be a political problem, it may be an economic problem, it may be a commercial, but there's always, at the core, there is a problem, and then you have to work to help find a way forward that addresses the issue and finds a way out, either fixing the problem or making it more acceptable for them to accept a European solution. And for me, one of the things I really regret about Brexit, the loss of the UK, for me, it's losing a member of the family. And I really do deeply regret it. I'm sad. It's not that I can get angry about it sometimes from a different perspective, but I'm just deeply saddened that a member of the family is walking away, as you would feel in a domestic situation.
So I want to turn to the questions. Sir?
Hi.
And if you could please tell us your name and just if we can all keep the questions relatively succinct and with a question mark at the end, that'd be great. So please go ahead.
Mr. Ambassador, good evening. It sounds like, according to you, the European Union is mostly based on the fact that you guys have put nationalism aside and are now working together. In recent elections, I think, especially in the United States with the election of President Trump, and in Germany recently, we saw a rise in nationalism among many countries in the world. Could that be a destabilizing factor for the European Union, or do you believe that the European Union can move past that?
I'd be interested in hearing about your reaction to the German election in particular as well. That's something I didn't ask you about. It's an interesting part of the question.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I mean, just to be clear, I didn't say we've decided to put nationalism aside. On the contrary, I think I've talked a lot about the importance of preserving our national identity, our culture, and our sense of identity that comes with nationalism. What I said is we've decided to put aside using that as a sort of weapon against our neighbors or against our other countries. That's what we've decided to put aside. You don't have to define. Nationalism should define itself in pride in what you are, what your country is. It should not define yourself as being better than the neighbor or somebody else, whether they're Jewish or Muslim or whatever, living in your country. That's not nationalism to me. That is racism, that is xenophobia, and that ends up in war. Patriotism, love of country, pride in country is a positive thing, and we're not trying to set that aside. But you are right, there is a rise in identity politics. There is a tendency in many of our democracies for parties to try and gain political traction by emphasizing this issue of identity, of superiority, of the importance of one nationality over another. And yeah, this is dangerous. I think we have to firstly, we have to accept it exists, and we have to deal with it, and we have to explain why it is not the right way forward. On some level, I would prefer that these people actually stand for election and have the courage to stand up and say, this is what I think, rather than doing it clandestinely or on social media or behind the scenes, so that it gets out in the open. And then, you asked me about the German election. I mean, the interesting comment, I think, about the German election is that Germany is not quite the exception to the general trend that maybe we all thought. So I agree. The interesting phenomenon is that the Alternative for Deutschland, this sort of heterogeneous right-wing party, has made a breakthrough, got 12.5% of the votes. It's 12.5%. It is what it is, but they will have 90 seats in the Bundestag, and this disrupts a bit German politics. Having said that, is it a seismic event in German politics? No. There will be a coalition of centrist parties who will govern Germany, and I think Germany will pretty much continue with the same policies as in the past. I don't believe myself that the AfD has a great political future in Germany. Already they've had an internal row and one of their leaders has walked out. I don't actually believe they have a coherent policy, and I think many of these populist parties, once elected and actually put in a position of having to do something and deliver for the citizens, failed to do so. The Five-Star Movement in Italy, once they got a few mayors elected, they turned out not to be great managers of the cities. So I think we should not be afraid of parties like this emerging. I think we just have to pay attention to why people vote for them. People vote for them because they're frustrated. They're not all fascists, they're not all racist, they're not all xenophobes. There's something missing in our system. We're not delivering for some of these people. 40% of the people who voted for the AfD in Germany had never voted before in an election. What is also interesting is that the great support for the AfD in Germany came from Eastern Germany, the Eastern Länder of Germany, former Eastern Germany, who didn't even have many migrants and refugees. So, you know, it's a complex. You have to try and understand why people are voting for these parties, and there is something missing in our politics that is, we're leaving a certain part of our people behind with our politics. We have to address that. I'm a bureaucrat. I don't stand for election. I'm not a politician. But I think politicians from the established parties have to figure out what is missing and how do you rebuild those bridges. But so I think there are risks in the situation, but I remain relatively confident. If I look at all the elections in Germany, through the elections in Europe, through Austria, the presidential election last year, in the Netherlands this year, France, I remain relatively confident that the center is holding. But there are risks, and if we don't address some of the causes of those risks, we could face greater problems in the future.
Ma'am.
Yes, Arlene Walker Andrews. I have a question about joining the EU. So you talked about that there's something in there to allow people to leave, but how restricted is it in terms of people joining? I think Croatia was like the last one, but how do you define Europe, so to speak? I'm not saying Montana wants to join, but say a country that's sort of leaning up against the African continent wanted to join. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'll try to give you an answer that doesn't leave us here for the rest of the evening. In the treaty, it says any European country, European democratic country, can apply to join. It's a pretty broad definition. Where does, some people would say, is Turkey a European country? We've accepted that it is. They have applied to join. They have candidate status. We're in negotiations. Things not going very well at the moment. We will see. Could Russia apply to join? I once was with a group, you were joking about Montana, I was once with a group of, America has always been very supportive of enlarging the European Union, and broadly speaking we agree, but sometimes it felt like they had a very broad definition of what Europe should be. And I was talking to a group of American diplomats one night, and I said, so you want us to keep expanding the European Union, so then we take in all these countries, we get to Russia, so Russia joins. So I said, basically, your principle is, every time we expand the European Union, the next door country becomes a candidate for membership. So I said, who's next door to Russia? Is that Alaska? So I mean, in practice, we actually have some fairly strict criteria about which countries can join the European Union. And they mostly involve functioning market economies, democratic structures, the rule of law, human rights. For example, controversial perhaps in the United States, no country which has practiced the death penalty can join the European Union. The requirement to join the European Union, you must have abolished the death penalty. This could be an issue with Turkey, which is flirting with the idea of reinstating the death penalty. Just an example. The only countries at the present time who are guaranteed a sort of a future membership, but they still have to meet the criteria, are the Western Balkans, because we still feel we have a historical imperative to try and address the really difficult problems of that region following the breakup of Yugoslavia, and we think joining the European Union is the only thing that makes sense to give them a framework in which they can manage their many complex relations. And we're working on that, though they still have a lot of homework to do before they would join. After that, when you move further east, Ukraine or other countries, frankly, we will see. I don't believe there is any appetite at the present time in the European Union for another big expansion, but 10, 15, 20 years from now, that could change. I just want to add that I do believe that the enlargement of the European Union in 2004 to bring in 10 countries of Central and Eastern Europe, then Romania and Bulgaria in 2006 and Croatia in 2013, I think has been a huge success. Many people said we couldn't make it work. I think we have, and I think it was a historic imperative to have the reunification of the country. We can't claim European credit for the European Union for bringing down the Berlin Wall. I think we can claim credit for the fact that the collapse of the Berlin Wall did not lead to a downward spiral of violence, national conflict and destruction, but rather the orderly progression of those countries towards normal Western liberal rule of law democracies. Now, there are some issues with Poland and Hungary, you could say, and we could have another discussion about that, but I think we can claim credit for that orderly progression from totalitarian communism to Western liberal democracies, which was in large measure achieved also because of the membership of the European Union.
So 2 more questions, and then I want to give David a chance for a last word. Sir?
So my name's Sean Belbraic, and you mentioned the origins of the two unions, the U.S. as a response to colonial oppression and the EU as a response to the cataclysms of World War II and the Great Depression. With that, we've always struggled with our founding values of sort of the ideas of equality and democracy and how that turns out when you actually try to apply those in the real world. And similarly, the founding values of the EU of peace and prosperity seem to run contrary to history and human nature. How will this go forward necessarily when the good times end? Even in the relative crisis, there hasn't been a major European conflict or a downturn that, as bad as 2008 was, it wasn't the Great Depression. What is the EU's plan for the bad times?
For me, there are 3 founding principles of the European Union. You mentioned 2, but I think there's a third I need to add. You said peace and prosperity. For me, it's peace, freedom, and prosperity. Because we are democracies, we insist on the rule of law, human rights, and market economy. And those are fundamental, is another fundamental. We need those 3 things. I'm surprised you say, how will we deal with the bad times? I actually thought we'd come through the bad times, and I was looking to a more optimistic future, where actually we feel the crisis is, relatively speaking, behind us, and we're actually on the up. And I think we have just come through a remarkably difficult period. There are few countries in Europe that have not gone through a very difficult moment with the Great Recession. Countries like Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Spain have taken real pain. Now, they had to do it, it was necessary, but it's been very difficult to get through that period, and I think we are now actually seeing the returns on some of the very difficult and painful decisions that were taken in terms of structural reform, in terms of shrinking public deficits and so forth. So I think what holds the European Union together is what holds your constitution together, if I may say so. It's institutions. The difference between the European Union and other international organizations like the United Nations or the WTO is we actually have solid institutions, whether that is the European Commission, which is responsible for the sort of defining and working towards the European interest, whether that is the way in which the Council of Ministers, which represents the elected governments of our member states, and the directly elected European Parliament, which represents the people, the Court of Justice, which is a Supreme Court, which is the ultimate arbiter of European law and of conflicts. These institutions are very solid, and they see us through some of the most difficult moments. And you also have very strong institutions, and they see you through some of your more difficult moments. And I really believe that institutions count in the building of a democratic and a functioning democracy. And I think actually on the European Union, we have built very, very strong institutions. They're not perfect. They are infinitely perfectible, and we will continue to tweak them and work with them to see if we can't make them better. But they ultimately are the guarantor that we will get through our different crises, and that we will find solutions which do not result in the system falling apart, but rather in its surviving and improving itself as we move forward.
Sir.
My name is Michael Punke. You alluded earlier to sorting out the benchmarks against or for Iran. I'm curious about Greece. I haven't heard anything about Greece for a while. There's some benchmarks for them as well, are there not? And how are they doing?
Well, I think you haven't heard too much, because actually things are not going too badly. I mean, Greece has been through a huge trauma. I know the country well. I have great affection for Greece. I think it's a remarkable country. But the effect of the crisis on Greece was to throw up not just a sovereign debt problem, not just a sort of public deficit problem, but almost an existential problem of the viability of the Greek state, because they were seen not to have all the full modern apparatus of tax collection, of administrative structures which were needed to be an integral part of the European Union and to be part of the euro. And they have had to take enormous numbers of very painful decisions to restructure their civil service, to restructure their pension system, their tax collection system, their land registration system, as part of the process of the bailout and saving them from bankruptcy and allowing them to remain in the euro and to become once again a thriving economy. I believe they have come through that. They have done 90% of what is needed, and they are now starting to see the benefits. Their public deficit is now down to about 1.5% on an annual basis. They are starting to see economic growth. Unemployment is coming down, and I believe, and by the way, they've had to do all of that in the midst of a refugee crisis. And the incredible compassion and generosity of spirit of the people on the Greek islands who were wading out to rescue refugees coming in and crashing boats and offering them shelter and food when those people themselves didn't necessarily have enough food or enough shelter for themselves, is something which the Greek people do not get enough credit for, in my view. But they have done that, and they are now coming through it, and I think Greece will, in my view, 5-10 years from now, will be a very, very different, thriving economy as a result of the tough decisions which they've gone through. And I think they will get a return on the difficult investment they've had to make.
Ma'am, you get the last question.
I appreciate hearing what you had to say about the humanitarian part of the Greek culture. But my comment is different. Mine is kind of a nationalism. I'm Sister Elizabeth Olsen. And one of my problems is when I hear that people interchange us with the name United States or America. It's like we're not synonymous. Canada doesn't say Canada of America, or Mexico doesn't say Mexico of America. And I feel like so much of the time, the United States has taken over the nationalism of the other continent. And so it's kind of like, I think we have to be more specific when we're talking about the U.S. instead of referring to the U.S. as America.
You want to comment on that, David?
Well, you know, I'm sure you're absolutely right, and forgive me if I use the word, you're right, America refers to the sort of whole continent. But, you know, I understand, you're such a big and great country. It's like when you talk about the World Series in baseball, I allow myself a small smile, right? You know, this is the US and Canada, right? It's not exactly the whole world. So, I mean, the World Cup in football is the World Cup, right? When you win it, you've beaten the world. When you win the World Series, you've had slightly less competition.
Well, no, we're really going into, we're going to get off a really controversial topic here if we're not careful. David, we've really appreciated your insights tonight, and I do want to give you a chance for any closing thoughts you have, any questions we haven't asked you, or just insights or comments that you have from whatever perspective.
No, listen, I've talked more than enough, and thank you for your patience in sitting through this. Thanks, Michael, for doing this. Thanks to the university. I mean, the only thought I'd just like to leave you with is, Europe is on a journey. You know where we've come from, 2 world wars, the Holocaust, you know, a horrible legacy. We're trying to do better, and I think by and large we've succeeded. It's not perfect. I don't know where it'll end. What I want you to leave with is the sense that we're trying to make it better, and we're trying to make Europe a better place, and make Europe make a contribution to making the world a better place. And I know that sounds like Woodstock, but that is what we are trying to do. And in this, the United States is an indispensable partner. We know that Europe alone is never going to be able to influence world events in the way that we wish. I respectfully suggest that you are not going to be able to, on your own, are not going to be able to influence world events in the way you would. The days when the US and Europe agreeing on something where a sufficient condition to move the dial globally are over. China is there, Russia is there, Brazil is there, South Africa is there. The world has changed. We live in a very different environment, as you know, Michael, from Geneva. I remain convinced that agreement between the US and Europe on the way forward is a necessary condition for ever moving that dial. And I hope that that's something we can continue to work together on. You've got your politics, we've got our politics. It won't always be easy, but we have so much more that we share in common than anything that divides us. And for me, that's been the joy of this job for the last 3 years. And for the next 12 months, I'll be in Washington. And one of the other great pleasures is getting out and about and visiting all the different parts of this country. And it's great to be back in Missoula, great to be in Montana. And as I say, thank you for the welcome. And I hope this will not be my last visit. Thank you very much.